Hello, everyone, and welcome to Astrology Hub's Cosmic Connection. Today's topic is Venus, Mars, and the eclipse. And I am here with the Merlin astrologer, Rick Levine, and we are so happy to be here with you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. How are you doing with all of this intensity, with this energy? Are you learning to work with the energy and start to transmute it? Are you taking action? What are you doing with everything that's going on? And Rick started the last time we were on, he started with a poem. So let's hear it.
And we will do this again. So this is a poem from a book called Love Letters to the Milky Way by a man named Drew Dellinger, who Cornell West says, Drew Dellinger is one of the most creative, courageous, and prophetic poets of his generation. I love his spirit, don't miss him. And this particular poem is called Hieroglyphic Stairway. It starts off intense and stays intense and then gets more intense, but I'm only going to read the very beginning of it because it just seems so poignant for what's going on right now. And the poem is called Hieroglyphic Stairway. It's 3:23 in the morning and I'm awake because my great grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great grandchildren ask me in my dreams, what did you do while the earth was being plundered? What did you do when the planet was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing. As the mammals, reptiles, birds were all dying, did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? I recommend this guy. His stuff is really, really good. I'd love to have a session and just read the entire book out loud from beginning to end, but I'm a poetry geek. I love poetry. Because poetry comes as close as music through words in touching us in a place that is beyond the language of the words itself, the language itself, and poetry conjures up images. And I think that what that poem for me is representing now is that we are in the middle, halfway. We are halfway through a year that astrologers have been saying this was going to be the year. That we are in a year that has a once in 35 to 40 year Saturn-Pluto conjunction, where in a year where Pluto begins to return to where it was when the United States was founded, which means that the structures of colonial America were in great upheaval leading up to the American Revolutionary War, and incidentally, the French Revolution also. We're in a period of time, not only when that happens, but when that happens, also this Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurring in the sign of Capricorn. The last time Pluto was in Capricorn, the United States was founded. The time before that was in 1519, January 1518, I'm sorry. And when Pluto was in Capricorn, then Saturn lined up with Pluto. And that was within a couple of months of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the wall of the church that began what we call the Protestant Revolution, but let's call it for what it was. It was the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation. It was reforming through protest, and basically taking the 1500-year structure of Rome as the controlling piece, and it basically took that down. So we are in extraordinary times, and on top of that, you had the fact that unlike then, we also have Jupiter in the mix. And so we've not only had a Saturn-Pluto conjunction this year back in January, but we've also had Jupiter conjuncting Pluto, now retrograding back into a conjunction with Pluto later this month, while Saturn is retrograding back into Capricorn, Saturn moving into Aquarius, and Saturn moving from Aquarius back into Capricorn, then back into Aquarius. And when Saturn moves into Aquarius, we do seem to be concerned with the humanitarian structures, and it's been pointed out on the internet recently in a meme that's been going around that is not quite correct, but it does say that the last time Saturn was in Aquarius was when the Rodney King riots were. And in fact, that incident unfolded when Saturn had just moved into Aquarius. The riots occurred shortly thereafter when the policemen who perpetrated the violence were actually acquitted. And then before Saturn left Aquarius, there was a federal trial, and 2 of the 4 officers were found guilty. So that was one Saturn cycle ago, and Saturn does have its own cycles. But unfortunately, the third thing in that meme, which said the Rodney the Rodney King issue, and then secondly the Pluto being in Capricorn during the birth of the United States. The third thing it referenced was that Neptune was in Pisces when the Roman Empire fell. And that's just not true. It's not even close to true. It's just a made up fact that someone got wrong. So if you've seen that going around and the bottom of that meme says, and these 3 things are occurring now, well, they're not. However, bigger things are occurring. And that is with Jupiter in the mix, there's another whole layer of power, and shift of power that's going on, especially since Jupiter is going to be catching up with Saturn as they both move into Aquarius the end of this year, which is another powerful cycle. And on top of that, we have these retrogrades of Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto, the 3 heavyweights involved in all of this. Into that mix, Venus turned retrograde, and Venus retrograde is playing a very particular role right now in what's unfolding as a trigger, especially as we approach tomorrow's eclipse, which we'll get to in just a moment. But the thing is that as we move on through this period of time, Venus turns retrograde soon by the end of the month, and Mercury turns Venus turns direct, Mercury turns retrograde, Neptune turns retrograde. There's just this incredible whirlpool of a swirling energy that is being played out right now. And into that, we have an eclipse tomorrow, a full moon eclipse, the Sagittarius full moon eclipse.
Okay, so why did you want to hone in or focus in on Venus and Mars? And then, of course, the eclipse.
Yes, well, it's not Venus and Mars and the eclipse. It's the eclipse and Venus, and the eclipse and Venus and Mars. Just slightly different order. What I would like to do now is I would like to try sharing my screen and see if that ruins the sound. We had a little bit of sound problem before, but I think we should be okay now. Let me just make this a bit bigger. And you should have on your screen now a picture of a chart that is dated June 5th, 2020 at 12:12 p.m. And this is calculated for Redmond, Washington, but there's no ascendant in this, meaning that I have an Aries rising chart. So it doesn't matter where in the world you are, as long as you readjust your time zone. If you're in New York, this exact same chart will show up for 3 hours later clock time, but the same moment, 3:12 p.m., or in Hawaii, 9:12 a.m., or wherever you are on the planet. So what we see here is the moon at 15 degrees of Sagittarius, opposite the sun at 15 degrees of Gemini. all full moons are a moon opposition the sun. In fact, all full moon eclipses are the moon opposite the sun, with the nodes, and that's right here at 29 Gemini, close by, because when you have a full moon or new moon that's close to the node, that means that that the Earth is on the same plane, which means that there's a shadow cast, whether it's the moon in front of the sun, as it will be in 2 weeks at the Cancer solar eclipse, or at the full moon eclipse where the Earth actually casts its shadow on the moon. So we have in all eclipses a polarity set up, and here the polarity is between the big picture, Sagittarius, the ideas, the philosophies, the long-term wide horizon vision. That's Sagittarius. Gemini is the data, the localized information. And the polarity here is an informational polarity between what we perceive and what we would like to believe. So this is basically one way, one of many ways of looking at this eclipse. And eclipses often have an electric or Uranian influence, not that they're ruled by Uranus or anything, but there's a suddenness to them. I mean, the moon has been growing larger, fuller, day by day for 2 weeks. And then in a matter of hours, it's dark. And then in another matter of hours, it's light again. It's like someone is playing with the light switch, flipping it on and off. And it creates this sense of confusion and kind of popping out of the moment. And eclipses do alter time to the extent that most astrologers believe that the impact or influence of an eclipse can occur as much as 6 months or even more before the eclipse, all the way up through 6 months after the eclipse. So whether you're watching this today or tomorrow or next week or even next month, this eclipse is incredibly important for setting a tone to the energies for this year, for the year 2020. Now, in this eclipse, you will also see that Venus, which is marked with the little RX retrograde, is within 3 degrees of the sun, which means that over the past few days, Venus has retrograded. Matter of fact, if we back this up a few days, you can see there's Venus, forget about everything else in the chart. There's Venus on the other side of the sun. And here we can see Venus right there lining up with the sun. And now Venus is moved on, just a bit further away, but Venus is still in the eclipse. It's still in the beams, and it's still close enough to the sun that it's part of the picture, which means that there's this whole energy of love, of the attraction to that which is aesthetically perfect. But of course, in Gemini, that attraction is scattered. It's multivalent. It has lots of potential and possibilities, but it's about thoughts and communication, not necessarily about actions. Now, what we want to do is we want to add into this picture. We want to add the planet Mars, and this is why we're talking about Venus and Mars and the eclipse. But it's, first of all, it is the eclipse. Secondly, it is Venus lined up with the eclipse. And now, thirdly, it is Mars that is 90 degrees on one side to the moon and the other side to the sun. So in effect, this creates what astrologers call a T-square. I know it looks like a right triangle, and it is, but if you were to just make a line from Mars directly into the top of that triangle, that would be the T. And so a T-square is 3 points out of 4 points on a grand square. And this mutable sign, T-square, mutable meaning changeable or adaptable signs, is basically focused on Mars. And as Venus is the planet of love, attraction, desire, even money, because money buys pleasure, it's pleasure. Mars is the warrior planet. Mars is the angry red planet. Mars is the planet connected with Aries, and Aries is Latin for the warrior. And in fact, let it not be forgotten that Venus and Mars in the Greek mythology were the cosmic lovers. Venus was Mars's consort. And so there is an interplay of energy here between the feminine, Venus, and the masculine, Mars, that are at 90-degree angles right now. Now, 90 degrees is the most, physicists would call the 90-degree angle the most destructive angle when you're looking at wave phase interaction. So we astrologers say that the 90-degree angle, or the square, is the most conflictive, because whenever you have two planets at 90 degrees or multiples of 90 degrees, meaning a conjunction at 0, at 90 degrees, or an opposition at 180 degrees, or a square on the other side at 270 degrees, that all of these points on a grand square have to do with stress that needs resolution. We humans don't like stress, and we typically do one of two things when we encounter it. We fight or flight. We either engage it and resolve it, hopefully, or we get the hell out of there. Now, the problem is that when we get the hell out of there, when we run, it doesn't solve the underlying issue. And so one other thing I want to say before I want to get to kind of the punchline here is that the rough rule of thumb in astrology is the faster the planet moves, the lighter weight or less long lasting the implications of its movements. The slower the moving of the planet, the heavier and the more the more base, the more fundamental, the more powerful the manifestation is. To the ancients, Saturn was the slowest moving known planet. They couldn't see anything out past Saturn, and Saturn was the ultimate heavyweight. Saturn was Satan. Saturn was you got what you deserved. Saturn was not a nice planet because it was the end, and the end wasn't always, or it was almost always not nice. I was going to say it wasn't always nice, but in ancient times, the end was not a good thing. And so Saturn was that heavyweight. As we moderners have moved out and discovered Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, we've discovered that there are even heavier weights that at first were called transpersonal, but the fact of the matter is that we personalize these collective or transpersonal energies. So when a planet moves slower, it gains more power. Normally, Mercury and Venus and even Mars whiz through the signs. Mercury, when it's moving as fast as it can move, moves almost 2 degrees in a day. I mean, it can whiz through a sign in 2 weeks. That's twice as fast as the sun. Venus normally can take about a month because it tracks at a similar rate to the sun. Mars can take typically about 6-7 weeks to go through a sign. But when any of those planets turn retrograde, one of the things that we forget in our fervor for understanding or blaming retrograde planets for doing all kinds of bad shit is that when the planets slow down, they get heavier. They act like outer planets because they're moving slower and they carry more weight. That's what Venus is doing right now. Venus moving retrograde back over territory where she already was last month and will be again when she turns direct and catches up to the sun for the third and final time. This is about a recovery in the underworld. Venus, as it's lost into the light of the sun, the ancients said she became invisible. She went into the underworld. And when she comes out as a morning star, the energy will be different. Now, here's the thing is that this eclipse has this battle between Venus and Mars being fought out real time. We have people expressing indignance at how the military or how martial law or how the police state treats certain peoples. And the idea that Venus conjuncting the sun and retrograding, recovering from the old, there's the sense of going back into the past and bringing it into the present moment, but it's running into this square with Mars. And so how is it being met? It's being met by Mars, that's the macho, militaristic, suppressive, you're just a woman, you're just black, you're just excluded, you're not part of the deal, and we'll show you. We, certainly heard that in the president's words to the governors, where he said, don't be wimpy, don't be a jerk, don't be a pussy. He said, show your dominance. And that's Mars. Mars shows dominance. And there's a place for Mars. There certainly is a healthy place for Mars. And in Pisces, though, and I know I said this last week in our talk about the month of June, that one of the magical things that Mars can do in Pisces is that Mars can become a spiritual warrior. And so we have to be careful during this eclipse, which is I'm not a good, bad person when it comes to astrological judgment, but there are a lot of people saying this is a bad eclipse. Why? Because traditionally Mars is considered to be a malefic or a bad planet, Saturn and Mars, not because they're inherently bad, but because they're hard to get right, because it's easier if someone hits us to just want to hit back. That's what Mars does. It's that impulsive energy. And the other thing here is that if we add, and I want to add one other piece here, I want to add aspected points. I want to add Saturn into this mix. And we're going to, I think this will do this. We're going to add Saturn and Jupiter and Pluto and select. All right, now we see another layer of lines that just appeared, which are orange lines. Now, I didn't want to make this complicated too fast, and it's not really that complicated, but the fact of the matter is that this coalescence, this wide conjunction between Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn. Look, I mean, it's only 6-7 degrees across this entire spread of planets here. That's still considered a conjunction. And so what we have, if we take this 90-degree angle between the moon and Mars, it comes out to be halfway point to that is at 1 degree or 0 degrees of Aquarius. So it turns out that Saturn is a half of a square, that's a 45-degree angle, to Mars on the one side, and a 45-degree angle, a half of a square to the moon on the other side, which means that it's connected to the sun and the Venus by a square and a half called a sesqui square. Sesqui, like 1.5, like a sesquicentennial is 150 years. It's 100 1/2. A sesqui square is a square and a half. And so we have another layer of what we astrologers call corroboration on the fact that there's very hard energy out there that can tempt us to become Saturnine. What does that mean? Hardened, creating more boundaries, solidifying in order to express that Martian, martial, macho, militant energy, to suppress this dialogue, which always occurs when there's an opposition between the inner and the outer, between the moon and the sun, between the philosophy and the ideas that are set out, let's say, in things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Those are Sagittarian high ideals that we need to live up to. And yet with the Venus and Sun in Gemini, the fact of the matter is what we're experiencing is the energy right now, right here, in every which way, in every city around the country, around the world. So this is why the Venus-Mars is so important. And I'm going to take the screen sharing here off. No, before I do, I want to add one other thing And then I want to say why this Venus Mars is so important. But what I want to add is, let's go back to aspect points, and I'm going to add Mercury and Mars to this mix. I'm going to add Mercury, and Uranus, Mercury and Uranus to this mix. And I'm even going to throw in Chiron at the risk of doing too much too fast. And we now should see a bunch of other stuff appearing. But I want to focus on this Mercury moving through Cancer. Now, again, Mercury moving through Cancer normally is a 2-week run, but it's going to be closer to 2 months because that Mercury is going to turn retrograde and it's going to come back through the same area again. So Mercury also is gaining in power. It's the little guys right now that astrologically are having their voice. And during this eclipse, Mercury is making 2 very important aspects. First of all, it's making a sextile to Uranus. This is perhaps the closest only easy release of all the energy that's going on. And what does that release of energy mean? A sextile is a flow of energy, but it's not exactly the same as it would be like in a trine where it's water to water. In a sextile, you have to stretch because it's different elements, but it creates an opportunity. And so here the opportunity is for the long-held, inwardly kept feelings. That's the Cancerian part of Mercury. Mercury in Cancer doesn't like being loud. It doesn't even like being seen, but it's very protective of its own security, its homeland, its family. And Mercury, the communicator here, is forming a cooperative sextile with wild and crazy rebellious Uranus that's going to release the energy, but it's going to release it in a way that somehow is expressing something in a more cooperative or more, what's the other word I'm looking for? There's a sense of supportive, that's the word I was looking for, way rather than just throwing invectives or accusations. The other piece, though, here is that Mercury is also forming an aspect to Chiron, and it's square to Chiron. It reveals the depth of the hurt, the wound, the pain that Chiron has endured, and yet it's also now offering a way to creatively resolve. Remember, all squares can be negative if they're in denial, but if they're faced, they can actually be the creative juice the juice that motivates creative resolution or solution. And so here, what we see clearly from this eclipse picture is the importance of expressing in caring, keyword, caring, kind. These are Cancerian words. In expressing in caring and kind and compassionate ways that which needs to be brought out into the open, even if it doesn't conform to what we've been taught or what we've thought. That would be the Uranian wild card factor. And square to Chiron, even if it brings up old hurts and wounds.
Okay.
Now, I'm gonna unshare my screen so that we can talk.
All right. Okay, so very intense swirling of energy. The eclipse itself is themes around a polarity between long-term vision and data. Like, how do we interpret that one piece of it?
Yeah, well, the long-term vision is we live in the United States, the land of the free, the home of the brave, the Declaration of Independence. We're all free. The country is here to basically allow everyone to be free. Oh, except. And here we get to the Gemini data. When you begin to look at the facts, they don't match up with the ideals that we've had. You know, and this is true often in that Gemini Sagittarius polarity. You think of the Sagittarian holiday. You know what the Sagittarian holiday is? We seem to have made every sign of the zodiac into some outstanding holiday. And the one, well, it's the first Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, and
Right.
and the first Thor's Day or Jupiter Day after the sun moves into Sagittarius, we celebrate Thanksgiving. It's the
Mhm.
ultimate Sagittarian holiday. Why? Because people from a foreign land came across, across the world. They engaged with foreigners who showed fellowship and friendship and took care of them. And at Sagittarius, there's no shadow. We look at the uplifting, the high-minded side. We get together and we're thankful for all the blessings that we have. This is all Sagittarius until you look at the shadow. And that's the information doesn't support the ideal of what we learned. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the relationship between, the white man coming and the Indians was not this, oh, here, let us feed you and let's save you. It's let us feed you, let's save you, and then let us be killed by you. It's not quite. So we have this clash of the Sagittarian ideal, which is meant to be held. That's what ideals are for. And yet the data, what's happening on the streets doesn't conform, regardless of what your political leanings might be. What we're seeing doesn't match up with what we're being told. And so the experience of even people, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people from Auckland to London to crazy places around the planet. It's not just Minneapolis and Seattle and Portland and Los Angeles and Boston and New York and St. Louis and whatever. It's everywhere. And people are going out and being confronted with a reality that doesn't match up with what they believe their constitutional rights are for freedom of speech, to be able to go out and protest peacefully. No, instead, a street is tear gassed so that a politician can hold a Bible in front of a church that offends the bishop of the church and says, this is awful. Again, it's hard not to be political here because the politics are in fact stretching us, and it's causing all of us to look at what our assumptions and our beliefs are. You've gone mute.
So Rick, can I ask a bigger question, and then I'll ask a second
You're in
question.
charge. You can ask
All
any
right.
questions you want.
Do
I
you
cannot answer that.
believe?
No,
Do
go ahead.
you believe that the universe is benevolent?
Ooh. I believe that the universe is polarized and is balanced, and I believe that life or animated forces constantly vie for their survival. And if that's what you mean by benevolent, I mean, one person's benevolence is another person's death. If I'm protecting my family from someone who just came in with guns cocked in my bedroom, and my benevolence is to protect my partner, my loved one, my family, and to reach for a weapon, which I'm not necessarily encouraging. But if someone does that, it's their benevolence that is acting out of love to protect the invasion of someone they love. Now, if that happens to be aimed at a policeman who then kills one of those two people in bed, and I'm here talking about Breonna in particular, then that is not good. In other words, it's hard to say. Even the word benevolence is a tricky word because it's, when something is good for me, it isn't necessarily good for everyone else. Now, benevolence in a wider factor, well, even that gets tricky because people have different interests and things are complex. When you bring issues to the table, this is what negotiation is about. It's how do we create common ground that creates the greatest good? And the word good and benevolence comes from the same, they're both Jupiterian words. Jupiterian words are words that have to do with the giant gaseous benevolence, bounty, plenty, power, these expansive words that build up. And so whether it's good or benevolence, these are expansive energies, but they have to be contained by Saturn. Otherwise, the structures fall apart. And when we see Saturn too repressive, then Jupiter has to explode to open up those boundaries. This is a constant dance that we are right in the middle of right now, because every 20 years, Jupiter, the planet of expansion, lines up with Saturn, the planet of contraction, which they will do in December of this year. All of this is prologue, to that, or at least process. And so is the universe benevolent? You decide.
Yes. Okay. And so the bigger invitation here, I mean, there's so many themes happening all at once. So it's hard to hone in on one, but you said, and I wrote as fast as I could, but it'd be great if you could repeat it, to engage with caring, kindness, and in compassionate ways.
Those are all Cancerian words.
Okay. That which needs to be brought out. So that which needs to be,
that's Uranian, needs to be expressed.
Okay. And there was something else you said at the end of that I didn't catch.
Well, what I was talking about was the sextile between Mercury, the communicator planet, in Cancer, which is about nurturing and caring and kindness and compassion. I mean, other planets or other signs can certainly have some of those qualities, but that Cancerian energy is the lunar maternal energy of nurturing. And because of the sextile to Uranus, Uranus is irrepressible. Uranus is I know I've said this in previous times, whether here or not, is like once the lightning starts to strike, you're not going to stop it. It's like once a nuclear reaction begins to occur, you can't contain it. And Uranus is irrepressible. Even Saturn cannot contain Uranus. And so what we have with the sextile is, how do I use that compassionate, caring, kind communication in a way to say what is unsayable, to speak the unspeakable, to rebel against that authoritative Saturnian energy that has become overly repressive in a way that does the most good. Okay, so I use the word good, or benevolence.
Okay, so that really is, Narane asks, please tell us how we can pass through this period of time. I mean,
I'll let you know next year. No, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. I think I do know that there are some practices which I would recommend, which I've been trying to employ, some days better and some days not as well as others. And it's first of all, we need to breathe and we need to feel all the feelings. Because if whatever those feelings are, not feeling them, putting them into denial, putting them aside, is going to make our reactions overreacted on the other side in a way that is not helpful. Psychologists call that either overreacting or reaction formation. And again, whether you personally believe that the rioting and looting needs to be stopped, and if we need to use nuclear weaponry, then whatever it takes, just do the damn deed and end this, or whether you think that any use of military is bad and that people are justified. I mean, look, you can say from a removed perch that rioting and looting is not okay, but every museum in Western Europe and in the United States is filled with the results of rioting and of looting. I mean, when you win a war, you loot it and you take the proceeds and you then put it on show. I'm not saying this is a good thing. Please don't misread me. But for saying that that's not okay, tell that to the American settlers who basically started a riot by throwing over tea in Boston Harbor. That was an act of destruction. It was like burning a storefront. It was ruining the wealth, of the landowners and the owners. And it was an act of sedition. It was an act of rioting. And so this entire country was founded on a bunch of revolutionary terrorists who were rioting and in fact looting. Again, I'm not condoning the action. I'm just saying that when this occurs, one of the things we need to do is to feel how we feel. And then we need to absorb the information of what's going on out there, whether it's supporting what our feelings are or not. And then we need to integrate them. And there is no one answer. I mean, I consider myself a pretty smart boy, and I don't have a goddamn clue, And I know you and I have talked about some of these things off air, but the fact of the matter is that there are so many issues right now that are being polarized, whether it's the politics, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Trump, whether it's vaccinations, whether it's global warming, whether it's racial inequality, there are things that are just layers upon layers and upon layers. And just because you're agreeing with one doesn't mean that you agree with the person who agrees with that, who disagrees with 6 other things. And so we need to be open to feeling what we're feeling and to breathe with those energies. But then we need to listen to the things that are most painful, most not painful necessarily, but most opposite what our assumptions are. And we need to listen to what those people are feeling. It doesn't mean we need to believe, it doesn't mean we need to join them or their cause. But this whole thing is only going to be resolved as the individuals in it resolve their own polarities. And if we at least understand where this person is coming from, if we even understand that, that the giant pharmaceuticals that invested millions of dollars into denying that smoking causes lung cancer, it's not so far a reach to think that these exact same executives and companies might be spending money to give us another, feed us another line of goods, because we are a corporatocracy that is driven by profits. And so now someone else might say, oh, well, no, that's not okay. We need, libertarianism and all government's hands off. Fine, if that's your belief, believe it and feel it, but look at all the other facts too, because no one is right in this. In fact, everyone has only part of the picture. So how do we get through this? We continue to educate ourselves. I'm a privileged white boy. Granted, I grew up in a town where I was identified as a Jew, and I was harassed and I was excluded in ways that seemed pretty major as a kid, but seemed pretty minor compared to being shot to death or being kneed to death. And so this past week, I've been on a really deep dive to, I've probably been way less productive than I quote unquote should be, because I've been doing my best to absorb as much as I can, so I don't become just an invisible say gooder and do badder without even knowing that the shit I'm doing is actually feeding into the stuff. And that's what we can all do. And again, I don't care where your politics are. I don't care if you think that climate change is a hoax. The 6th extinction is not a hoax. Unless you think that's a hoax, then you think science is a hoax. I don't know. The lines are all slippery. There's no one answer that fits all. But I say, feel your feelings and then take in information that may not be comfortable.
We had an experience of that on our team this week. We have most of the team were white. We have our amazing tech goddess, Erica, is a Caribbean Black woman. And there was a moment we actually watched together the Michael Beckwith sermon from Agape from Sunday. So as a team, we watched, a 40-minute sermon that he gave that was just off the charts. And then afterwards, people were sharing how they felt. Yeah. And for the first time, I got to hear Erica talk about what it is like to be the mother of 5 boys that go out into the world, and how she is afraid every single day, how she's texting to make sure. And the reality, it was amazing to witness the reality of what she has experienced being a person of color in this country, and how prevalent it is in her day-to-day existence. It's not something she can take on or take off or forget about, or it's there.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that my eyes were opened so wide to the reality of that experience. And as she was speaking, to feel it, just waves of just feeling and holding space for her, and we all did. And she loves us and we love her. And it wasn't about right or wrong or anything. It was just to give the space to just be there and witness.
Yeah.
And it was
That's it. That's it. Wait, I mean, that's exactly it. That's why I read that little poem at the beginning, because it's something that we all should be able to feel, that energy, even though it's not something we necessarily always think about. I mean, I am, I don't want to say tired, exhausted. There's another word, of so many people who are posting, this is the most amazing time ever. This is the great awakening. Life is beautiful. I just had a 10-day vacation that was amazing. I get it. All these things are good for different people, but that's not the worldview. That's a closed up individual's point of view. And many of those people would then say, no, if those other problems are not mine, they're not real, they're only real if you make them real. Well, that's a bit of the denial that I was talking about earlier, that we all slip into at times. We have to, it's a part of survival. But when we live in that, and we don't ever have the experience that you just shared, that I've had, several of this week, and hopefully will continue to, as uncomfortable as they make me feel, that's what this time period is about. Remember, this is not but this is an apocalypse. And the word apocalypse, as most of us have come to understand, simply means without a cover. With the book of Revelations, the word revelation is a translation of the Greek word uncovering or apocalypse. It's not, the book of Revelations is not about the apocalypse. It's the book of the apocalypse. Now, I'm not saying this is the apocalypse, because I'm not a fan of the in front of anything that's important. Whether it's the truth, it's a truth, whether it's whatever. And yet, this is an apocalypse. We are being revealed. Things are being revealed to us, whether we want to know them or not, and whether we dig the ostrich hole deeper and stick our head in it, or whether we brave up and simply encounter what our feelings are as we encounter these uncomfortable feelings. That will determine where we go from here. That's our work. That's our work. And it is shadow work, because, when you stick your head in the sand, that's basically you're hiding in the shadow.
Mm-hmm. It's we started the Venus cycle yesterday, I guess, depending on where you start the cycle, but and
for people who don't know what Amanda's talking about, that is when retrograde Venus lines up with the sun. That becomes the originating point in the cycle, the synodic or sun-centered cycle of Venus relating to the Earth, where it will do that in the same place in the sky, roughly every 8 years, and it'll do it 5 times at on 5 points of a 7-pointed star over those 8 years. And so that happened yesterday or the day before, depending on where you are.
Right. And one of the things we talked about is how the Venus cycle maps with the Inanna myth. And so this going deep into that darkness, and that is where you were saying before, you were joking about about Pluto being where all the juice is, being where
I
all the
wasn't. I wasn't joking. That was off. We were off mic. That wasn't joking at all. This is the basis of William Blake's *The Marriage of Heaven and Hell*. Where he says that hell is a place so beautiful that it would torment an angel to insanity. It's where hell is basically where the transformation occurs that turns death into life. Hell is everything after death and before rebirth. And so the hell realms, are the juice. That is the magic. That's why there's an entire branch of astrology called evolutionary astrology that's largely built around the work of Jeff Green and others certainly who have followed him and have added deeply and widely to it, that basically are about Pluto, because Pluto is associated with the underworld. It's Lord of the underworld. And interestingly enough, it's Mercury that we were talking about that's now sextiling Uranus, therefore encouraging us to express. It's Mercury that in talk therapy goes into the underworld and brings out the things to make them, to shine the light of awareness onto the shadows. That's Mercury's job. In fact, in mythology, Mercury, one of Mercury's jobs was to be the psychopomp. Mercury was the guide to take the dying person or dead person across the river and guide them into the underworld. You see, it's because Mercury moves back and forth between aware and unaware, conscious and unconscious. So all talk therapies are basically about sending Mercury into the plutonic realms of hell and bringing things out into awareness and then working with them, dealing with them. That's what therapy is.
So you mentioned with Mars that you talked a lot about Mars. You mentioned briefly that a higher expression of Mars is the spiritual warrior. What is that like higher octave expression of Mars? Because we talked a lot about the lower octave Mars.
Well, two things. First of all, um, it's not just the spiritual warrior as a higher expression. I wouldn't use the word higher octave because planets have octaves. Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. Neptune is the higher octave of Venus, and Pluto is the higher octave of Mars.
Right.
But the let's say the higher manifestation of that energy, certainly, certainly when one is fighting to protect a worthy cause, that's Mars at its best. When one is defending those who are unable to defend themselves, that's Mars, the warrior, at its best. But you see, in ancient astrology, before Pluto was discovered, Mars was connected with Aries, the warrior, and with Scorpio.
Right.
And so we forget that Mars is not just the fighter, Mars is also the lover. Venus is what you love, but Mars is the lover. Mars is the physicality of expressing that energy. You see, when Pluto was given to Scorpio, Mars became stuck with Aries only. So Mars lost its wetness because Scorpio is a water sign. But Mars, mythologically, energetically, has feelings. Mars is passion. Mars is the what you do with the desires to resolve them, which is not necessarily negative. In fact, it is procreative.
Okay. So I think, as we're seeing some other expressions of Mars that are definitely the lower expression.
You mean like setting fires?
Yeah.
I mean, no, that I wasn't pulling that arbitrarily. That is an expression of Mars. Mars is the angry red planet. You see, another thing here about Mars is every planet is associated with an ancient, the ancients had 7 primary metals. The sun was related to gold, or I should say gold to the sun, silver to the moon, Mercury to Mercury, Venus to copper to Venus, iron, we're going to come back to that in a moment, iron to Mars, tin to Jupiter, and lead to Saturn. Let's stick with the Mars and Venus just for a moment. Mars, which is iron actually burns at room temperature. but it burns slowly. It typically needs water to make that burning process occur. We call it rust. Rust is just oxidation. It's very slow burning. So the angry red planet is red because it's made up of iron that has been burnt, is fired. Okay. And of course, it's no mistake that the metal iron was one of the first metals that was used in war. Venus is related to copper, or I should say copper related to Venus. Copper is worthless in war. Why? Because it's too pliable. But copper is beautiful, and it's great in art. Copper is, copper is also more conductive of electricity, than anything else, which is why we use copper wires, or we used to when we had wires. But the thing is here that what makes our blood red is a compound called hemoglobin. Most people know this. But what most people don't know is that the complicated molecule of hemoglobin has iron in the molecule. And it's the oxidation of that. I mean, the hemoglobin, the red blood cells, is actually what carries oxygen around in the body. So it's that red energy, red meat. I mean, it's basically from what makes animals red is hemoglobin in blood. Now you compare that with plants, and I no longer have my lilies. They're way, 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 way back there on the other side of my room. But you have lilies right behind you, and although the lilies are white, the one thing that almost all plants have in common is not their color red, but
Green.
green. And it turns out that copper, when it oxidizes, becomes green. It's anyone who's owned any sort of copper, a vase or whatever, when it tarnishes, it turns greenish. And that is the same green because copper, sometimes manganese, is also in chlorophyll, which is not, the blood of plants, we don't call it blood, has chlorophyll rather than hemoglobin, which contains copper or manganese rather than iron. So again, here we even come back to the Venus and Mars, and I have to, before leaving the subject, I have to bring in my dear friend Bruce Lipton, who we were talking about this one day, and we were talking about the differences between Venus and Mars. The kind of modern astrologer who says that John Gray's women are from Venus and men are from Mars has to go because men have Venus in their charts and women have Mars in their charts, and we have to learn how to express that energy. And Bruce says that all may be true, but it turns out that by body weight, most, and this is totally a generality, but it's a statistical generality, that most men have a higher percentage of protein to overall body weight than do women. And most women have a higher percentage of oils or fats in their body compared to men. Now, it turns out that protein, like iron, is bipolar. It's like it's magnetic. And so protein becomes like the iron that builds it's like the Legos that build the structures in our bodies, whereas sugars and oils are not bipolar. They're dispersive. They're field rather than polarized. And so the difference between Venus and Mars here is interesting, but I'm just going to come back full circle to this eclipse and this period of time beginning. It's been tracking for almost 2 months where Venus and Mars have been 90 degrees to each other. And we're seeing this not only as a battle between gender, Venus and Mars, but more importantly, between the inclusivity, Venus, the attraction toward love and peace Venus, and Mars, the create boundaries, defend it militant.
Okay, so the higher invitation for this moment comes back to so many of the themes we've been talking about in terms of considering many different perspectives, not being so attached to one viewpoint, knowing that there's lots of different ways to see things, doing our best to collect that data with an open heart, with an open mind, and to communicate with each other as compassionately as possible, and to really start to bridge those the polar extremes that are happening as much as possible. And, I think one of the outcomes of that team meeting was absolutely a deeper level of togetherness than we've ever experienced. And I even talked to another one of my team members who's in Seattle and has been on the streets protesting. She was talking about the togetherness that she feels with all the people out there. So as this is happening, that's also happening.
Yeah.
And so
there's one other piece in this that, as you were talking, I came, I know you've done some dancing, but when a dancer is pirouetting, and they're pirouetting rapidly in succession, the thing that makes them not get dizzy, not throw up, not lose where they are, is that they pick one point, and even though their body is spinning, they turn their focus back to that point as soon and as rapidly as they can, both on the leaving it and the approaching it from the other side. You understand what I'm saying? That makes sense?
It's called spotting.
Spotting. Thank you. I'm not a dancer. I mean, I have danced, but I'm not a dancer. But I do have Gemini rising, and I love to connect dots of things that other people don't. All right. So the thing is that when we're Neptuned, when we're confused, when we're spiritual, when we're outside of the normal boundaries, and we're being open, it's like when we pick a truth, when we pick something, whether we know it or not, we've spotted it, and it becomes a stable data or stable datum that then everything else spins around. And we need to be really careful when we do that. That stable datum might be suppress these thugs no matter what. That's a stable datum. And we need to have these stable data, but we also need to be aware of what they are, so that when we're not under duress, when we're not in the immediacy of spinning, that we can step back and we can look at that and say, what is it that I'm focusing on? And what is it that I can learn that maybe can help me change my focus, widen my perspective, so that I have more to focus on rather than just that one thing, whatever it is.
What is it that I'm becoming? What is it that is mine to contribute? What are the gifts that I can bring? I mean, there's so many questions we can be asking ourselves to help get into a place where this, this, is it good? Is it bad? Is it benevolent? It's like you said, you choose.
Yeah.
You choose.
Yeah. And another thing on the Venus Mars thing, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least bring this up, but I'm going to bring it up very carefully, because I don't want to make less of what the immediate urgent situation is, that this Venus Mars square, retrograde, eclipse, and also let's understand that Mars moving through Pisces is moving towards a conjunction to Neptune. Venus has been squaring Neptune on and off and will continue to, so that there's this whole higher spirituality and melting of boundaries also in the mix. But that this whole thing is also part of an extension to, and maybe a spotting point on the spinning of the Me Too movement. In other words, and I'm not trying to reduce either one to the other. They have similarities, but they're very different issues, but they're still about the re-equalizing of energy that has been imbalanced as Mars has dominated Venus, as the warrior has dominated that which is suppressed, whether it's gender related, class related, racially related, nationalistic related, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this piece that is a part of it too. And and I think what's really interesting in all of this, and this was brought up in a podcast that I saw the other day, that was it was Colin Bedell, and it was he asked a brilliant question, and it was about the inherent misogyny that is in the fact that this entire peace movement was established around a Black male who was apparently not necessarily a nice guy. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because it doesn't matter what he was. The fact is that he became a focal point for something that's very important. But just a few weeks ago, Breonna Taylor, a woman, her perpetuators are still out free. And so we have this gender inequality even within this larger issue that is incredibly important. And then, of course, if you add the number of deaths that have been pointless of transgendered Black women, you talk about the whole intersectional, of various, I don't want to say minorities, I want to say excluded. Remember, Pluto is really not just the hell realms, it's everything that's been damned or excluded, which is what the hell realms really are. And so I think that part of this Venus-Mars square is also an opportunity to again, if we're widening our focus, is not just focus on one event, and I'm not saying anyone is, but to really look at, there are multiple issues here that are all coming to a head simultaneously. And the more we can use this moment, this year, to expand our awareness, and to take things into our new perspective, the better situated we will be with wherever this goes as it unfolds, and it will continue to.
Rick, thank you so much. Thank you for being here again, another week. This is, it's such a pleasure to be able to be here together and to have you translate this language of light for us and help us stay anchored in astrology.
And of course, I appreciate the same with you and what you're doing. I would also be remiss if I didn't remind people, if they want to get my little daily blurbs, best place to do that is on Instagram, and to follow me at Rick Levine Astrologer. I write something every day, 7 days a week, good, bad, or ugly. And it's a good way of just keeping your finger on what I like to call the pulse of the planets.
Yes, highly, highly recommended. Check out Rick over there. And for those of you who want to join us for the free solstice panel that we're going to be doing on June 17th, we're going to be talking about this solstice and eclipse that's happening, why it's so significant, and then also looking into the energies that are going to be with us through the end of the year. There's going to be 7 different astrologers on that panel. That is free. You can go to astrologyhub.com/solstice. And then we'll also be coming together to do a ceremony on the actual solstice, which is the 20th. If you sign up for that solstice event, you'll also get all the information you need for the ceremony. We'll also make sure people know about everything that's going on these different episodes that we have. So, but the best way is to go to astrologyhub.com/solstice and make sure that we have your information so we can send you what you need. Okay, everybody, huge energy. Take care of yourself.
See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.
All right. Take care, everyone, and we will see you soon. Aloha.